Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. In a changing world, Ant, there is but one constant, and it's the way you disappoint me every time I ask you this exact same question. What's new and exciting in your world this week, Anthony?
A study published recently in the American Journal of Medicine looked at behavioral differences amongst vaccinated and unvaccinated people. They're talking about the COVID vaccine. They found that people who were not vaccinated were 72% more likely to be involved in severe traffic accidents.
What the hell?
Right. It got me thinking about correlation and causation. Correlation, of course, are two things moving together. Causation are two things moving together because one is actually influencing the other. I give my students an interesting couple of examples. In the 1960s, from the 1960s to about the 1980s, the number of sunspots closely matched or were closely correlated with the number of Republican senators.
Well, clearly. You know, everybody understands this, I think. When I was young and I would sit down to watch a game and the Red Sox won, I would make sure I wore those same set of clothes the next day.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And all of this kind of idiocy. Every sports fan understands exactly what I'm talking about. Your choice of a T-shirt has nothing to do with how a baseball team might or might not perform that day.
Yeah, and this is the argument I make to my students. I show them a graph of sunspots and Republicans in the Senate. You could see it, one goes up, the other one goes up, one goes down, the other one goes down, and so forth. And I say to them, clearly there's no causation here. There's no way that sunspots cause Republicans or vice versa. To which the more astute students will respond, okay, so one thing isn't causing the other, but the fact is, if back in the 1960s, 1970s, you showed me this picture, I could use sunspots to predict Republicans in the Senate, and it would be a useful predictor.
Well, by accident.
Well, that's what I say, by accident, to which they respond, yeah, but who cares? What matters is it's predicting. And I thought about that for a while, and I said, look, here's the problem. This graph I'm showing you didn't exist until the 1980s. That is, that we could look back and say, look at that. These two things move together.
You needed 2 decades worth of backstory.
Right, yeah. And of course, by the time you come to the conclusion that these two things are moving together, because they're only moving together by randomness, all of a sudden they're no longer moving together. So by the time you realize the relationship exists, the relationship is gone.
Sure, 1960 to 1980 isn't that interesting. But there were all kinds of things that if it were 1460, a bunch of people would have been killed because of it.
Yeah. Well, first off, I would have been burned at the stake as a witch for having pointed any of this out.
That's right.
But
you're a heretic. You and your mathematics.
It calls to mind other examples like this. The one I love is some decades ago, Coke was rolling out its product in developing countries. And this was India, I believe, that they started selling Coke there in some city. And then they moved on a couple of weeks later to another city, rolled out, sold lots of Coke, moved on to another city and so forth. And what happened, as you look back at the data, is in each city in which Coke then had this big marketing campaign and pushed out a lot of product, about a week later, there's an outbreak of hepatitis. And this went city after city after city. You look at that and say, well, maybe it's the sunspot thing. It's just by random chance. It turns out this was not random chance. There actually was causation here. But just because there's causation doesn't mean we understand the causation. And what happened here is the health officials became very nervous and started to make noise about investigations into Coke and what is it about Coke that's causing the hepatitis. It turns out that's not the way the causality went. There was causality, but it wasn't Coke causing the hepatitis. What was happening is that young kids couldn't afford a can of Coke, so they would pool their change, and they would buy one and share it. It was the sharing of the thing that was spreading the hepatitis. So too here, it brings us back to this business about the unvaccinated people being 72% more likely to be involved in severe traffic accidents. Is it merely correlation or is it causation? I don't know.
Well, maybe they're just reckless.
There is one possibility that could explain causation, and that is that people who tend to be reckless would tend to both drive carelessly and therefore be in more accidents, and also be uninterested in things like vaccines.
That would be the first thing I would look at.
And for those who are interested in the terminology, that's what we call a third variable effect. That is, there is a causation present in this relationship between vaccination and car crashes, but it's not that one causes the other, it's that both are caused by some third factor.
I got to say, as you go, that was pretty interesting.
There we go. We start off the new year with an interesting story.
Now, I'm not going to say that if somebody else said that nonsense, if I would say, geez, that was interesting. Yeah, we dance with
Given
the man
the source,
who brought
it's
us.
interesting.
That's right. There's something new on the medical horizon that runs the risk of reformulating public health. It's a weight loss drug. Eli Lilly has a diabetes drug called tirzepatide. I believe I'm pronouncing that right. When given at a much higher dose, it takes obese people and makes them not obese. People are losing roughly 25% of their body weight as a result of being on this drug.
Wow.
Right. That's a big deal. As a diabetes medication, it's covered by medical plans. As an anti-obesity medication, not so much. Not only that, it's going to be a touch expensive.
How much?
$13,000 a year.
Oh my God.
And that's the alleged fair price that they're talking about, not the price that Eli Lilly would have liked to have charged. Apparently, there is a fair price mechanism to drug pricing in the United States. We'll get into that some other time. But it's interesting, right? Because on the one hand, we're told that obesity is a disease. Well, let's be a little more honest about things. Pancreatic cancer is a disease. How do I know this? You have no choice in matter. You get it, and it's incredibly harmful. Obesity is incredibly harmful. And I say this as a guy who has over time lost 70 pounds as of this morning. You can eat less and lose weight. There's no mystery to this. The mystery is why so many people who should don't. Is it a disease? Not really, because you can choose not to get it. Now, once you do get it, there are all kinds of terrible things that come along with it that surely do share in the nature of a disease. But it is a choice to let yourself become obese.
I would imagine, in fairness, there are cases on the margin that are actually genetic. But I would also imagine that those cases are small compared to the number of obese people.
I think almost all cases have a genetic component, right? Fat people come from other fat people. Nonetheless, you can still choose not to be a fat person. It may take you a lot more work than it takes any number of other people. And that's just how life goes. We don't make a more work exception for anything else. Why would we make it here? Stupid people have to work harder than smart people. Well, it's not like we're saying stupidity is a disease. It's a condition. You're going to have to learn how to deal with that. The same way a person genetically predisposed to becoming fat is going to have to deal with that. Now, just because they choose not to doesn't mean they can't. It just means it's hard and they choose not to. You know, it all comes into focus when you look at a drug like this come along, and it seems to work. I mean, this seems to be the real deal. And for $1,100 a month, you can lop off a whole lot of excess weight at almost no effort to yourself.
Has it been around long enough that they know long-term what happens when you stop taking it?
It does seem to be the case that if you're taking it for weight loss, it's going to be a drug you take for the rest of your life.
Ooh, it's $13,000 a year.
So when you're looking at $1,100 a month or so,
that's a mortgage.
That is a lot of money. Maybe it's worth it. Maybe it's not. Now, I think we can all say that the super fat, super rich are all going to be taking this and they're going to be much happier. But poor people, they're not going to be taking this and they're going to say that it's not fair that they can't. Maybe, maybe not. I think the interesting thing will be where we are in a bunch of years when this thing comes off patent and can be prescribed. That's likely where the game changing happens. It's not that I don't want people to have this option. Surely I do. It's just that there's no good way to give them this option right now. And so it is with every new medication that comes to market. It'll be interesting to see what becomes of this long term. Whatever the causes of the widening of the human body, we may have just found an antidote in an unlikely place. Which, of course, brings us to the foolishness of the week. And this one is probably going to sit like a burr underneath your saddle. I think we have to talk about your beloved Southwest Airlines before long.
Yeah.
And their very poor business practices, come to find out, or business practices that were great when the airline was much, much smaller, that did not scale up at all, finally came home to roost. And who knew this was going to happen? Apparently everybody. No one expressed any surprise whatsoever, least of all the pilots and the flight attendants. They all seemed to know exactly what was going on. This was an unmitigated disaster.
I read that not only were they unable to schedule their flights properly, but because of their antiquated system of tracking the crews, in a number of cases, they lost their pilots and flight attendants. They had no idea where they were.
So not only did the passengers not know where the hell those people were, neither did the airline. And look, I take shots at Southwest all the time because it is the Greyhound bus in the sky. Nonetheless, this is beyond the pale.
I got caught up in it. I was flying my son from Pittsburgh to Albany. He got to the airport, everything was fine, flight was a little bit delayed. Then his connecting flight was canceled in BWI. So we thought, well, no big deal. Worst case scenario, he can spend the night there and get a flight the next morning. And we got that all arranged, had a reservation for the flight the next morning, and then his Pittsburgh flight was canceled.
Sounds like exactly the story you heard from every other person on Southwest.
Yeah, this was the opening day of all of these Southwest cancellations. So what we ended up doing is I just brought him home. I said, look, we're just going to put this trip off until Southwest calms down.
You read the stories, right? And you're thinking, okay, things are not going well. And then I saw a headline that every single Southwest flight in and out of Tucson, Arizona was canceled.
Well, I think they canceled like 75% of their flights that day.
When it's your city and it's the entire spate of flights, you start to realize, okay, this is much worse than it first appeared to be. Because, look, I go to the Tucson airport all the time. I know how many Southwest flights are in and out of that place. It pales in comparison to the American flights, which is why I'm on American all the time. But there are a lot of flights going in and out on Southwest, and they were all shut down immediately.
As bad as all this was, I was amused that the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, gets on the news and says the Transportation Department's going to be looking into this, what went wrong at Southwest, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, aren't these the people that brought us Amtrak? They're going to be investigating what went wrong at Southwest.
As much as we all liked Mayor Pete when he was dazzling everybody at the debates, turns out, given a healthy dose of authority, he's not impressing anyone. He's really illustrated how unready he was for anything approaching prime time. What's the conclusion going to be? That Southwest really f***ed up and everybody missed their flights? Well, we kind of already knew that, right?
Right, yes.
Any idiot could have told you that, right? Anybody who tried to fly Southwest knew only too well what the problem was.
And I don't think the U.S. Department of Transportation has anything valuable to offer in terms of avoiding things like this in the future.
People always say, well, what do you want the government to do? Nothing? I'm like, yes, please.
That's exactly right, yes.
That would be so much better than doing something.
We are constantly extolling the wonders of free markets. And this is a beautiful example of things going wrong in the marketplace, and they will. Markets aren't perfect any more than government is perfect. But what makes them better is that a lot of people out there right now are thinking twice about ever using Southwest again. That puts tremendous pressure on Southwest to figure this out and fix it.
Yeah, either that or go out of business.
You're right. Get out of the way.
And that's a legitimate outcome to this kind of failure. I want to call you to task when you say free market, referring to the airline industry. There is nothing free about that market. There's not much free about any market you can think of, but that one least of all. I wish Southwest nothing but the best. They served a valuable niche. I hope that they continue to do so.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. If you're a full-time college student looking for something educational, fun, and free, apply to join me and James and several faculty who have appeared on Words and Numbers at the inaugural summer seminar on the theory and practice of classical liberalism. The week-long seminar is hosted by the Stevenson Institute at Wabash University and will be held June 5th through the 10th. There's no charge, and meals and lodging are provided. To apply, see the link in the show notes.
Pope Francis is at it again. The headline, I'm working from a BBC News article, which we'll put in the show notes. The headline kind of catches it. Pope condemns human hunger for wealth and power at Christmas Eve Mass. Of course, my hackles went up immediately upon seeing this in a way that I'm sure yours didn't. But here we have Pope Francis speaking out against wealth and power from St. Peter's Basilica, one of the most ostentatious holes down which wealth has been dumped for eons, it seems. Have you ever gone to the Vatican?
No, I've never been there.
I've been there a couple of times. I would go back in a nanosecond. There's a lot there well worth seeing. But I went the first time with a student group, and many, if not most, of the students who I brought were incredibly religious, very Catholic. I will remember it until my dying day. We walked into St. Peter's. It was me and I think 17 students. And I could see the crisis of faith crossing their faces.
Because of all the wealth that they're looking at.
They've been told for some time that the church is hard up on money and you got to give your weekly donation. And yet you get to a place like St. Peter's Basilica and it doesn't square with what you hear. There is no such thing as a poor church if you've seen the building. And if that doesn't sell you, well, then walk into the museum next door and start looking at the various treasures that the church has. How Pope Francis can say that the desire for wealth is a problem and not see where he is sitting, I don't know what on earth is wrong with him.
I have a different take on the whole thing. I'll preface my comments by agreeing with you that I've taken issue many times with Pope Francis and his, what I would consider an ignorant attack on free markets. And I mean that not in the sense of denigration, but actually he's coming from a position of not understanding what he's talking about.
Well, it is a position of denigration, right? Because he's smart enough to know that he doesn't know what he's talking about.
But in this case, I saw the article. The article was a summary of his Christmas Eve homily. I watched the whole thing, the actual homily. And I think it's mischaracterized in the article. He's not denigrating wealth and power. He's denigrating those who put wealth and power above human dignity, above justice. I actually came away not having any complaints with the homily at all.
Actually, that leads to more complaints for me, not fewer. People chase wealth, people chase power, they ought not. But that's not saying anything. That's saying, I don't like human nature. That's all he has said there. This has been human nature from time immemorial. His problem is with the very matter from which we are constructed.
Well, but even there, I think you don't give him his due. His argument is no different than the argument that philosophers have given for millennia that you give at the end of every episode when you say be nice to each other. Sure, it's human nature to be selfish, but we should all push against that to the extent that we don't put it above taking care of those who are more needy.
There's no good answer here, right? The Catholic Church has the holdings it has. It's going to make any kind of argument more difficult. And I'm willing to give them their due and say, look, it's a long history that played out over a couple thousand years that yielded this outcome. But it just rings hollow. And when you start thinking about a pope saying, I don't like human nature, well, that's just simply insufficient.
I didn't hear him say he doesn't like human nature.
That's all he said.
No, I don't think so.
When you say things like people gravitate towards power and money far too much, you're saying you don't like human nature.
No, you're not liking how people are applying their human nature. It's no different than you saying be nice to each other.
It's very different, Ed. I don't sit atop the Catholic Church. I don't wield actual power. When you look at somebody who has, I think, a very privileged seat at a very small table, different rules start to apply. When I see a pope, what I would consider to be whining, and imagine Pope John Paul II saying these sorts of things, it's incomprehensible. John Paul II had the training of a philosopher and he knew what he was talking about. And Francis doesn't. when you're looking at the flaws of human nature, and I would submit that we see them every time people do anything. This isn't the neat, tricky part, right? This is the easy part. The tricky part is dealing with it. How do you arrange your institutions in such a way? And this was where the American founders, I think, made the critical difference in the modern world when they decided, okay, look, republics from Aristotle to yesterday have all aimed at making men better. How's that working out for you over 2,000 years? Men are exactly the same as they have ever been. And, my students bristle at this. They think that people have gotten better over the centuries and that they somehow are better people than the people who came before them. I understand the urge to think that. I just think it's deeply incorrect. If you think we're doing all that much better now than we ever did in the past, I dare you to go back and read the Old Testament and the ancient Greeks' Platonic dialogues and go read some ancient Chinese texts, all from roughly the same period 2,000 years ago. And everybody that you'll encounter in those stories are your neighbors. They're people you have already met, people you know well. They might even be you, because we're all so deeply flawed, ourselves included. You and I are every bit as flawed as everybody else. I'm not sitting on high here saying I've got it all figured out and the Pope is an idiot. What I am willing to say is that there's a long tradition that I'm a part of and he's not. He should pay a lot of attention to it, because at the culmination of this long tradition is the realization that you probably can't make men better. What you can do is render things such that they have trouble misbehaving. And that's really quite a miracle. If you can do that, that's a wonder. Now, I know the church is in the business of making men better. To the extent that that can be done, that's a deeply individual thing. Right? That happens one soul at a time. And I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying you don't plan for that. You plan for the worst.
I think that the truth is somewhere in the middle. So you would point to, and I would agree with you 100%, the founders creating a government that played off the desire for power against the desire for power. So rather than say, look, we should all just not seek power, we admit that's what people are going to do and set up the government in such a way that the various branches fight amongst each other to cancel each other out. Granted, however, as you say often, we get the government we deserve. In other words, it doesn't matter how well you design the system. At the end, you've got to have people that have some sense of obligation, do I want to say, to each other, some sense of right and wrong, that they would behave in such a way to make the structure that the founders set up actually work.
But notice, you have no chance at all if you don't have the structure right to begin with.
Granted.
Right. Let me read the essential part from the Federalist. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. If you could water down all of human political history and say, what is the one problem at the heart of every political system, I would say it's this. Yeah, any idiot could create a government that can control the governed. That's the easy part. But how do you oblige it to control itself? And here's where you line up ambition against ambition. The greatest simple example is from James Harrington in the Commonwealth of Oceania. He's trying to figure out how you take imperfect or even immoral human beings and get just outcomes from their immoral behaviors and impulses. You would immediately say that's probably not possible, that you don't get moral or good results from immoral inputs. And yet Harrington shows this beautifully. Two girls, he says, want to divide a piece of cake, and each girl, of course, wants all of it. How do you guarantee a fair result? Easy. It's actually so simple, it's dumbfounding. Hand one girl the knife and have the other choose the piece she wants. So you have one girl cut the cake, and she is going to have every motivation to cut that cake right down the middle. Because if she doesn't, the other girl grabs the bigger piece.
And therein lies half of the story, which is setting up the institutions correctly. The other half of the story, which is what I think Francis was talking about, is those two girls have to agree that when all is done, the cake is cut, neither one of them is going to grab both pieces and run away.
Well, yeah, and the introduction of the knife in the story introduces a wrinkle.
Right, all kinds of options.
That's right. And look, they're examples, but this one is a particularly powerful one. It shows how you can take very bad subject matter and churn out very good outcomes. Human beings can be brought to behave. On the one hand, this is incredibly complicated stuff, and on the other, deceptively simple. From Aristotle to Montesquieu, philosophy didn't advance us very far. It took the endeavors of 1787 here in the United States, where we designed a constitutional republic around this idea that human beings are imperfect. We're never going to fix that. So given that, how do we live together better? People like to take shots at the United States, and I get it. I'll take my shot from time to time too. But in the sweep of human history, if I could pick anywhere to live ever, in any place, it would be here and roughly now. Something happened here that made human life better. How do I know that? Because people from the rest of the world die trying to get here. Is it perfect? No, not by a long shot, but it's a whole lot better than almost every place else. We didn't get here by saying, human nature, what can you do?
And this is the place where, in the past, both you and I have disagreed with Francis. And that is that when you create a place with good institutions like you're describing, and it ends up being a place where people want to come and they die trying to get here, that place necessarily, because of the people who come there, because of the institutions that exist, that place will create wealth that other places won't.
That's right. And I don't want to get into power, right? I think power is a corrupting influence, always has been, always will be. It needs to be mitigated. We do probably not nearly as good a job at that as we should. However, I am very happy that people come here to pursue wealth, because every time somebody gets wealthy here, we all benefit.
Well, that's an interesting thing, James. Wealth is a positive-sum game.
That is correct.
You can create wealth and it takes nothing away from me. In fact, it probably ends up making me better off. For example, look at Jeff Bezos' wealth, and what makes me better off is my ability to use Amazon. But power is a zero-sum game. The more you have, the less I have.
That's right. Power's bad news. And I think when you read the American founding documents, nowhere is wealth decried. Nowhere do they say, we have to keep these people from getting wealthy.
Yeah.
Now, when wealth buys power, you've got a problem.
Yeah.
And frankly, wealth always buys power. So let's keep that in our field of vision. But if Francis is going to say wealth is one of the great demons, or the chasing of wealth, he couldn't be more wrong. I want people to chase wealth constantly, because then even the people who don't chase it get wealthier.
Yeah, and see, I'm almost left thinking that we need two different words, because I think you and Francis would agree that chasing wealth is bad if the way you go about chasing it is by taking from others, by subjugating others. In other words, by using power to attain wealth.
That's right. You only get that way by purchasing political power.
Yeah. But if you become wealthy because you're providing things to others that others like, then that's actually a very good thing.
Let's be really clear. Almost everybody who becomes wealthy by serving other people. Now, what happens after they've gained a certain amount of wealth, then you might have a problem, because then they marshal resources to purchase political power. But they almost never get there having anything to do with politics, right? It's always by coming up with something new and exciting that people really want and that they'll pay for, that makes their lives better. You know, I've got probably a different kind of perspective lately. As many of our listeners know, I've had some really severe health problems. Just last week and a half ago, and they were bad enough that I almost died. And yet, the things that were brought to my bedside were nothing short of astonishing. It was astonishing, the level of care that I received that brought me from death's door to being relatively well off in just a few days. And none of that happened if people didn't wake up in the morning thinking, I'd rather be wealthy than poor.
Mm-hmm.
Because they got out and they started innovating. Who benefited? I did this time around. But we all do, all the time. It's just kind of hard to see because you think Jeff Bezos has how many billions of dollars and I'm trying to pay off the cable bill. That's not the right way of looking at things. Look at the lives that we all have. The best of us 100 years ago would be shocked at what the worst of us have as a matter of course right now.
Bezos' billions in no way make it harder for you to pay your cable bill.
No, that's right.
If anything, it may actually make it easier.
It's the other way around. And this is what Francis misses. He's got the economic sophistication of a 7-year-old.
But as this conversation progresses, I'm seeing so many similarities between how we're perceiving Francis and things I hear from people on the left in this country when they decry billionaires. And I drive home the point. I say, okay, what is the problem with Jeff Bezos having billions of dollars? And every single time it comes down to, yes, but with that much money, he can buy off politicians. That's, I think, ultimately the thing that people here on the left and Francis as well are concerned about. It's not the wealth itself. It's the power that wealth can accrue.
The funny thing about Bezos is he has so much, there's no point.
That's right, yeah.
He's hit the crest of the wave. There are others that I worry about a lot more. I'm infinitely more suspicious of every single person in Congress than I am of Jeff Bezos.
And notice something here. We could all agree, I would think, left and right, that the billionaire buying off the politician, this is a bad thing. But that's not a market problem. It's a political problem.
That's right.
It's a government failure. It's not a market failure.
These people have power to sell.
And so turning to the government and asking it to fix the problem, it is the problem.
That's right. And you realize that the only time you can really address this problem is at the moment of a founding. The political forces at the time of a founding drift away after the founding has occurred. A high-minded founding does not have a long-term leaching system the way that you might think. Now, you can have recurrence to founding principles over time. That's very difficult. It almost never happens. When it happens, it's very imperfect. So get it right, because you don't get a lot of bites at that apple. I doubt in my lifetime I'll see a real recurrence to it. You just see us getting further and further away. The takeaway here, yes, be very suspicious of people who seek power. Be very grateful for people who seek wealth, and maybe you should follow their example. But maybe you shouldn't decry the seeking of wealth from the world's richest chair.
The optics aren't good.
It's not, Ant. That Francis doesn't know he's being a hypocrite doesn't get him off the hook. He should have some institutional awareness. And when he first took the office, it was pretty obvious that he did have some institutional awareness. He walked in and tried to mend some fences with people who had been shoved to the back corner of every church room. We all looked at that and I thought, well, I don't really like his politics, but it's hard to find fault with him as a human being.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.